Okay. We can wait a few seconds for people to join and then we'll get started. Okay. Should we begin, guys? Okay. Hi,
Yeah.
everyone. Welcome.
That's
Welcome to the launch of the stained glass window. We're so excited you could join us. I'll start by giving you guys a brief introduction
mhm.
about our editors and then about the book, and then I'll introduce myself. So first we have Taha Kehar, a journalist, literary critic, and novelist. If you haven't heard already, he's published two novels, typically Tanya and Of Rift and Rivalry. And for things that are coming, two of his short stories will appear in an anthology called The Banyan and Her Roots. Taha is based in Karachi and he teaches undergraduate media studies, media courses, and he just completed a postmodern detective novel. So another thing to keep your eyes out on. And now I'll just introduce Sana Munir. She's authored two works of fiction as well, including The Unfettered Wings, Extraordinary Stories of Ordinary Women. Her writing has appeared in The Bridge, an anthology, the Aleph Review, which is a literary journal, and she writes often for the news on Sunday. So we have some great editors here and writers. So if you guys haven't already, you should pre-order and actually now order your book because it's available. Okay.
Thank you
Now
very much, Munir.
I'll give you guys a brief intro into the book and then you guys can talk a little bit about it as well, a quick summary. So, The Stained Glass Window, it's a really interesting piece of fiction that's come out and basically delves into the quandaries of quarantine, dissecting anxieties that essentially stem from it. It's a compilation of different literary works, including 26 different stories, both short fiction and flash fiction. The range of genres, versatile characters, both of them rise as a form of fiction to essentially inspire us in ways of coping and finding hope and even a little bit of humor in a time like this. Do you guys want to talk a little bit about the book on a whole?
Sure, Taha, you start first. Taha?
um, Anna, why don't you begin? I act.
All right, it's a collection of short stories. It's a collection of short form fiction and flash fiction. We had reached out to different authors or those people who we thought would love to contribute to the book, and I'm glad that a lot of people have. There are 26 stories in there. There's flash fiction, there's short form, and as far as the techniques are concerned, there are lots of techniques there. There's the unreliable narrator, uh, there's Mahin's story. It has a unreliable narrator, and it's a very good story. There's a translation in there. There are playwrights who have contributed. There are journalists or editors. There are poets, seasoned writers, and the purpose, I think, it was just to first. I think it was more personal. To be honest, it was more like to get engaged into some literary pursuit because a lot was not going on that end. But then when we started engaging with people and we started asking people to contribute, and then it became more like a task that was quite uphill, and that just it became just something more than personal. It became something quite diverse, and I'm glad that we did this. And I'm very thankful to those people who can.
Definitely. Taha, do you want to continue?
So, the stained glass window for me began as a curiosity. I think Kana and I jointly collaborated on this because we have a passion for fiction. We enjoy the process of writing, and fiction is something that intrigues us. It's perhaps something that is our way of negotiating reality. So when the world went through what it went through with the pandemic, we had quite a few challenges to encounter in our own lives. And maybe fiction is our way of negotiating that reality, making our way through it all. And this book, in a way, encapsulates so many different voices. We didn't want very selfish gesture. We wanted it to be something that everybody could be a part of, and that's why we wanted a medley of voices, a whole range of perspectives on the pandemic. It's very easy for us to just put out our stories, but we wanted a diverse perspective anthology have something new and engaging and refreshing to offer. So that's what this anthology is all about.
I love that. And um, I think even just thinking about the cover, if you guys haven't seen it yet, it brings that idea of things coming together and pieces kind of meshing into one whole. And that actually brings me to my next question, which is this. You kind of touched upon it a bit, Taha, but the importance of finding fiction in a time like that, when all of us were deep in the thick of lockdown. I think that's when you reached out to a lot of the writers. And that's why I love the idea of so many different writers, so many different times and spaces coming together, because in a time of isolation, fiction was that one thing that bridged the gap. So I want to talk a little more about the focus and importance of clinging to fiction, be it as a journalist when you are constantly writing stories in regarding the reality of things. When you take it and look at it through the lens of fiction, what does that mean? So, as a journalist, as a writer, as a reader, and as an editor, what would you guys say about that?
Who goes
Sana, do you
first?
Interesting
Yeah.
question. Sana, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. Okay, since this question is directly pointed at fiction alone, I think fiction or non-fiction, I think they actually just depend on the reader, what the choice is. So it's not just fiction that helps you through. It's just, I think it's books. So the circle that we function in or the circle that we belong to, we are connected on different platforms, through social media. So I think it was easy to spot those people or engage with those people who had been continuously posting ever since the city went into lockdown. There were a lot of people who were posting about their reading habits or what they had found solace in. There were some people who were reading about other lockdowns and other pandemics that have happened in the past. But then there were some who were escapists who really didn't want to engage with any of the lockdown or pandemic issues of the future or the present or the past, and they were just indulging into poetry or escapist literature. So that's I think that all those things, all this connectivity and relativity has a lot to do with how we approach people and how people responded. It's like it's a continuous cycle. You have to say that you don't really know which dot is going to connect with which one, but then it does. And fiction, I think, fiction or non-fiction or books, I think generally speaking, it's not everyone who would find solace in books. So being readers or writers, there are certain writers in this book who have been readers throughout. They have not really been published before, but I mean, I'm glad, very glad that they got this chance to, and they took the plunge. They took the plunge to actually say yes to the offer. Fiction or non-fiction or books, I think they're important to those people. They have helped those people through the pandemic, who find solace in them, even in easier times, not only in difficult times. Because I believe that if only books or poetry or fiction or non-fiction, whatever, if literature is only giving you help when you need it, it's a little it's a little Wordsworthian in approach. I'm not really a fan of it, that you just like nature because it's full of flowers and all that, but then there's this Tennysonian romance as well, but that's read in two now. So like if you're happy, you go to books. You're sad, you go to books. You're angry, you go to books. So I think that's the kind of thing which I understood, that those people who are really, really related to books, they have been, and there has been a lot of support. There has been a lot of support, not only just through the contributors who have written for this book, but also, all around, a lot of encouragement, a lot of good words, lots of good wishes. And I think that all really led to this day, that when you are holding your book, still waiting for mine. Still happy. It's something that gives me a lot of happiness. Yeah.
definitely? Taha?
So I think it has more to do with not just fiction alone, but a preoccupation with storytelling. Because storytelling has, since time immemorial, been a way for people to understand the world, a way for people to connect with situations and circumstances. Earlier this year, I remember being a part of a panel where we're discussing why we write fiction. And many people thought we write fiction to escape. And reality is, we write fiction to understand the world. We understand social circumstances through it. And I think this desire to suddenly uh, move towards fiction, especially with people reading on Instagram, online, because they have the time to do so all of a sudden. It's not something that is new to the pandemic or because there was a lockdown, there was nothing to do. I think it's been around for a while. So I'm not surprised that at a time like this, even under the pandemic, people are reading. People want to read stories about the pandemic. And yes, we have lots of books coming out about the pandemic. And perhaps at a time when cold facts are all we have about the pandemic, that this is the death toll, this is the extent of the infection. We forget the human experiences that are associated with those figures. So I think fiction can provide that avenue to fill that vacuum between fact and the essence of humanity and reality in those circumstances. So I think fiction has a significant role to play in this day and age. Yeah.
I agree. Yeah. And I think I haven't read all the stories yet, but looking through them, the range of experiences, just generally, I think every story is very experiential and it's a
Mhm.
form of coping. So dealing with it through grief or humor, mental health, wellness, or even tackling more relevant issues like what's happening in the world currently, medical practitioners like Hannah's story. I think that's really what will resonate with the readers to come, and that's what brings the story as a form of connectivity, I guess, a different form of storytelling. What I wanted to ask you guys, of course, since both of you have two different types of stories, one short and one flash, I want to just kind of talk about the process of writing flash fiction because that's something I think you don't see as commonly with short stories. So, what kind of brought you guys to decide to write two flash fiction stories, and what was the process behind it? How is it different from writing your own short stories?
Uh, it's a question directed at Mahin.
Taha,
Me?
you first,
Yeah,
whoever.
Taha, please go ahead. Please go ahead, Taha.
Go ahead, both of you. We can both take turns. I'll go ahead. Okay, I'll go ahead, I guess.
Yeah.
So I guess when it comes to flash fiction, it was something that we had previously decided that we will have a section on flash fiction, we'd have a section on short fiction, we will intersperse it. We had a mathematical procedure in which we aligned each story. It was supposed to be a break between all the stories. I think those flash pieces were far more meaningful. I'm not going to say than the short stories, but just the experience that we get from those flash pieces is very different and it's very
Yeah.
unique because you have a few words to tell the reader a story. And our own flash pieces, I mean, I don't know about Sana's, but mine just spontaneously came out on paper. So as far as I was concerned, I think with the pandemic, the theme that I was especially interested in was old age. And we were told time and again that the older adults were more vulnerable to the virus. And whether it was true or not, but that was something that we initially heard. And I was fascinated with that idea. And I think, in a way, both my stories deal with that. So when it comes to writing a flash piece, as I said, it was spontaneous, but it was also about understanding uh, whatever I was trying to write from that prism of old age. And I think Sana can continue with the rest since she has something to add. I'll add to this later on. Yeah.
Sure.
Oh, my flash fiction is a shared byline. You must have noticed, Mahin. The reason is that Zafin, she's written so much in the earlier days of the pandemic. She had written so much about the experiences and the threats that the doctors and nurses, the hospitals at large, they were facing. So those stories, when I just read them, there were several. I just realized that this is something that really needs to be translated into fiction. And I must say that it took me a day or two to get through all of those stories that were written by Zofine herself. But then, the flash fiction itself didn't take much time. I think it was under 1 hour or something. But the thing is that the trick about writing flash fiction is that it's not like writing other bits of fiction. You don't really follow any rules. It doesn't really have to have, always, it does not have to have a start, a middle, a big, an end, and then you don't have to be very like with it. It's not like that. It's just a chunk of reality. When you sit down after finishing writing a bit of flash fiction, you could add several passages above. You could add several passages, below. That's how a flash fiction works. But then you choose not to. That's the thing, the choice that you have to pick very carefully one bit of reality or one bit of fiction that tells the reader who the characters are, what they're doing, and where their reality is set. And that's very challenging at times. It really needs a lot of thought process. It really requires a lot of homework mentally. And then when you sit down to write, you have to be very careful in choosing and picking your words. Don't use alliterations, don't use repetitions. So there are rules. But then I think flash fiction is something that it's a choice that we give to a lot of authors. Because we thought that maybe, a lot of authors would have trouble committing to short form fiction
Exactly.
since them, a length for until up to, I don't know, 5,000 words or something. But then it was surprising that most of the authors actually chose for short form fiction because they had stories to tell. Full of
Remember.
that was very encouraging. So we actually we have sparsely placed the flash fiction through the course of the book, just to make it very calculative. I hope that the readers appreciate that.
Definitely, I think they will because
When it comes to, yeah,
I think it in itself is a reflection of, I guess, the whole pandemic, missing an end or a middle because time just ceases to exist at a certain point. And what interested me generally about both your stories, and I want to kind of like get into them a little more, was the narrative voices in general. So I'd like to kind of talk about each of your narrative voices, how you came to decide upon them. And Taha, of course, like your piece has a lot of humor, and Sanayo's piece is slightly dealing with something more serious when you get the whole idea from the doctor's point of view. And I kind of want to go into what drove you to rely on these voices as your form of expression. And does that have something to say about what you think you required or needed during the pandemic? Was that a reflection of what you wanted to connect to? So for so many people, you wanted to, like, people want to connect to humor, people want to connect to a darker side of things, to their own inner self-expression. So Sana, you can start first and talk a little bit about Wars.
Maheen, I don't really have much to say about this. My voice usually, not all the times, I'm trying to experiment a little now with my new writing, but my narrative voice is usually that of a woman. It can be a 10-year-old, it can be a 60-year-old, in my previous books even. The 10 short stories, they all have women protagonists, female protagonists. So I think these two stories also have female protagonists. I think that's something that is my. I'm trying to divert a little from here. That's it. I think that's how I find my narrative voice. That writers' narrative voice depends on a lot of things, on a lot of observations, a lot of experiences. For example, in this story, the short form fiction, which is set in a hospital or something, it's a doctor's story. I had to speak to a lot of doctor friends, both men and women, to see or hear or listen from their own first-hand experience of how they have been coping with the pandemic at hospitals. While every person was being told to stay at home, my children were at home. I mean, everyone was being told that you have to stay at home, just do that. But then there were people who had to go out. They didn't have a choice to stay at home. I think they had to work double shift. The doctors were one of those. Nurses were one of those. We have been listening to these stories on TV. We have been reading these stories in the newspapers. So I also had to venture out to one of the hospitals that was, it was specifically designated as a COVID center or something like that in Lahore. So I had to go there and I had to see how things. So finding a narrative voice is not always just it's just not a call from the back of your mind. It involves a lot of things. So if there's you need interviews, there are interviews, and then you decide. I spoke to male doctors, but then it was the female doctors and the female nurses who actually, they appealed to me, and I thought that their stories need to be told. So that's it.
Great.
So, as far as this book was concerned, we were changing different hats every now and again. We were editors, then we were writers. So, amid editing submissions, we also had to produce our own work. And the fact remained that I turned out my flash fiction piece before I wrote my short fiction. And Zohra Chahabuddin, who is the commissioning editor who took this book on and finally got it out into the world, um, asked us specifically, are these going to be dark, depressing stories, or are they going to be tales of humor? And at that point, I was wondering, okay, I'm dealing with this concept of old age. I'm fascinated by it at this point. Everything I have to write about it, does it have to be so depressing? Does it have to be bleak? So that's when I turned out my short fiction piece, which was a little humorous to the extent of being um, bizarre at some points because I had no idea where all of this was coming from. I had decided consciously that both my flash fiction and short fiction pieces would be from the third person perspective because me writing about the pandemic was an act of exploring curiosity and seeing what the world was doing at this particular point in time. It was easy for me to work with a first person voice, but I felt that my curiosity drove me to write from the third person perspective. Therefore, I kept both stories third person narratives. And Sana was talking about visiting a hospital. I actually did a lot of research on Google weddings, lockdown weddings. And I asked a lot of people what happens at these weddings because I didn't have the privilege to be invited to a lockdown wedding on Zoom. So I had to really ask people because weddings in our part of the world are idiosyncratic events for kinds of things, doing all kinds of things. Surely there was some latitude for some madness at these weddings. So I had to ask when I heard these horribly, I mean, disastrous stories of things that happen over Zoom with people saying whatever they wanted to say, Zoom bombers emerging from nowhere. I said, this is a story unto itself. And I said, okay, sure, I'll write it down. This is interesting. So that's what I had to do. I think what Sana said, it doesn't really come from just creative impulse alone. It comes from research. It comes from a sense of awareness as to what you want to depict. And then you have your story. And it's almost like a magical process. But when you're done with it, you feel so relieved. But yeah.
Definitely. That's true. The relief that comes after is just unfathomable. I wanted to ask if you guys would be willing to share a little bit from each of your stories, maybe just a paragraph or two, so we can give the viewers a taste of what's to come. Sana, would you like to go first? And you can tell us which story you're reading from.
Okay, I just picked it before we started this. So it's from my short form fiction. It's called The War Zone. And I've already discussed a little that it's set in a hospital, or it's about the lives of doctors who were fighting the pandemic from the front lines, and they still are. Okay, so this is one passage. I just randomly picked it. The bus that took her from home to work was chock-a-block with people. She counted the various ways she could have contracted the virus. From the pole she touched as she looked around for a seat, the seat in front of her, which she had just put a hand on to adjust her bag in her lap. The seat she sat on, the lady sitting next to her, the lady sitting across the narrow aisle, she stopped counting. To keep her hands busy, she rather grabbed her phone to look up for face shields, surgical gloves, and masks for herself at online retailers. She and her colleagues had been asking for protective gear from the hospital administration for some time now. She had spoken with a classmate interning with the most reputed private hospital in the city about the situation. Oh, we have had a stash of PPEs in the store, so that's not a problem, he had told Dr. Jasmine. What about surgical masks? She asked the friend, who replied, those too were in stock. That perplexed Jasmine to a great extent. I think I'm going to stop here. Jasmine, she
Yeah.
works in a public hospital, so that's why she's.
Thank you for
Lovely.
sharing. I'm sure all of you are excited to read the rest of the story. Taha, to you.
Okay, so this is somewhere in the middle of my story, which is called Intruders. This is the one about the lockdown wedding. And it begins with, okay, I'll just start. Shakil, don't be so antisocial, Negatapa shouted at her husband. Nusrat will be disappointed. I've connected the call already. I'm coming, Shakil said. I'm just taking my medicine. When she heard this exchange on the Zoom call, Mrs. Akmal nodded in satisfaction when she discovered that her reticent brother-in-law would be joining them for the ceremony. Shakil Bhai's gentle demeanor compensated for her sister's occasional flashes of unpleasantness. Without his presence, it became difficult to tolerate Nigatapa's sly digs and harsh comments. Into this, Nuzhat is also a nuisance, her older sister continued with a scornful look on her face. Who holds a nikah in the morning? I haven't even had breakfast yet. Assalamu alaikum, Nighatapa, Mrs. Akmal said, lowering her mask to convey the sting in her voice. Oh, her older sister winced, almost falling off her chair. You can hear me? So this is a little exchange before the wedding begins. It's a Zoom, and this Nighatapa doesn't know that she can be heard. So this is something that I thought I'd share.
Thank you. I think one of my favorite parts was the Zoom bomber part. Not going to give any more spoilers, but no, I think it's interesting, uncovering different facets of fiction in this time because, especially having it in one collected space, because you
Yeah.
go through all the emotions of lockdown and you kind of reflect on the times where you felt each of the emotions because it was such an interesting. I mean, we're still kind of in lockdown, I would say, but that's why the compilation I think is so striking. I did want to ask you guys, what do you think was one of the most challenging parts about putting this book together? And Sana, you can start.
Most challenging part, Mahin, to be honest, putting the book together has been, it's been a great learning experience. I don't think I have anything to complain about. That would sound very ungrateful, to be honest. I mean, reaching out to people, engaged, keeping busy. I had, there was so much going on at that time. I had, my children were attending school from home. I had just let off all the household stuff. So I was managing domestic duties on my own. And then there was always this to fall back upon. This was like a safety cushion. This is something that helped me maintain my sanity. The most difficult part, I'm going to say this, was only the wait that has ended today. I think we submitted this book in August, and until then, from to here, that's been the most trying time because
Yeah,
when is it
wait.
coming? There were so many people. It was not just me or Taha or uh, to worry about the book. There were so many people who were so eager, who were so keen, and they were looking forward to the publication of this book. And they would be asking questions all the time. And I understood and I appreciate that they were so eager and they had faith in it and faith in the editors. So I think that's been a little difficult, but I'm glad that's over too.
Of course, and I'm guilty of that also, Taha, asking you.
I know.
What about for you, Taha? What would you
No,
say?
you can ask me a question. It's perfectly fine. I think this was a very cathartic experience because this is something I could fall back on as well. Something that gave me a lot of joy. I began the session talking about our shared love for literature and fiction in particular. And when we were putting this book together, I think the thing that I was most concerned about initially was that would we be able to capture a diverse spectrum of experiences in one book? I was just thinking now we have a compiled version of this book and everything is fine. We love it. But there are so many other stories that could have been told. I mean, I know of someone who had COVID and he was in a room that was haunted. And I said, that would have been an excellent story to include in this anthology. And my only concern was, are we going to be really capturing the essence of everyone's reality? And I realized, you know what, we can't do that because every experience is different. But I think there were no challenges as far as that was concerned. We worked symbiotically. It was something that just came together, and we were lucky because our work ethics were fine. We were perfectly, like, in sync when time with work. This was our, as Sana said, our safety net, the forest we could run to after all the other things that were going on in our lives. So
Great. And I think, yeah, definitely storytelling always continues. There's too many stories to kind of bracket them in one form.
mhm.
I was really interested with the poem you chose for the beginning, but and if you want to kind of talk about that decision to have it there.
Sorry, Mahin, I couldn't get to you. Are you talking about the poem by
Mm-hmm.
Mehwat? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So I reached out to Mehwat. I mean, I've known her for some time. I truly appreciate what she's doing for with the Aleph Review. It's an amazing literary journal. So I just reached out to her and asked her if she would like to contribute, and she was like, yes. And well, it turns out that when she sent her submission to me, it was a poem, and I was overjoyed to have it because she's a big poet, and it also poetry means a lot to me, and I was glad that this poem could be actually be used as an opener or as an introduction to the whole book, because she quite, since you must have read it but the readers haven't, uh, the book quite captures the whole essence of poetry, of the pandemic itself, and the threat a person might feel about or giving it to others or suffering from it. So it's a beautiful poem. So it was not planned, but I'm glad that Mevish sent it in and we could make it part of the book. We
Yes,
needed
I love that. I think listening the book
I
up
think
to a
there
poem,
was a
having that,
certain, yeah,
it was it was great. It was a great opener. It just kind of very artfully and carefully depicted the feelings that
yes,
will kind
yes,
of later
it's
on
lovely.
pop up in the book. Taha, do you want to add something?
we were
Or
actually
shall I cut you off?
surprised because there was a certain prescience to that poem. Uh, Mavish hadn't read any of the submissions, and even so, she was able to capture everything that other writers were talking about. So it was just the perfect introduction.
Yeah,
And she talks about the joys of it, the sadness. It's a very lyrical poem, something that we had to include. And it had to be somewhat separate from all the other stories because it just was the perfect opener, the perfect way to begin. It was the Bismillah moment for the book. So, yeah.
Definitely. I think it worked out perfectly. And I would, if you guys wouldn't mind talking about it again, a bit more about the cover, and we discussed it in the literature festival session, but I would like to talk about it a little bit more because I think it's something so fascinating the way it connects so much with the story. Do you want to
Uh-huh.
decide how you came upon the idea for the cover and even the idea for the title a little? We can just briefly touch upon it.
Mhm.
Anyone
Now,
want
you
to
want to
go
go
first?
first?
I was about to ask you the same, but it's all right. I think in glass window. Are you talking about the pictorial imagery? That's what you're talking about. You're talking.
Both that and
Yeah,
the
okay,
title.
okay. That just came to us. That's something that came to us in a very, 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 very simplistic, minimalistic way, and we thought that it would be very good to have something circular, on the cover. That was something that just because it represents so many things. The globe. represents the clock. It represents kind of day and night, and I'm glad that the designer, he really understood, and rather, he emphasized on what we had in mind, and he just went ahead with, the girl with the mask and the day and the night going, coming. I think it's a very it's very detailed. It's not, these details were not really decided by us. It was the designer. We have to give the credit to him, of course. But we just wanted a stained glass thing. That's what I think. That's what was in, to just make sure that the cover depicts what the book actually is about in a very symbolic way, and that is bringing together different hues and shades into one collective. I think the designer has done a very good job at it.
I agree. I love it.
Yeah.
Taha, do you want to say something about the title?
The title. So the thing is, this title means different things to the both of us. For me, I imagined, because I think in images as well. So for me, it was the mere mention of a stained glass cathedrals and all of that. The reality was that me, it was a room of my own imagination with a stained glass window, and when sunlight strikes that window, it gives different patterns on the floor, and those patterns tend to evolve as the day goes by, and that for me was the symbolism for our lives under lockdown. This image right here, I don't know if you can see it, it shows the transition. It's the other way around, um, inverted, but it shows the transition from day to night, and that is what the stained glass meant to us. For me, it was the perfect symbolism for the way we live our lives. The day goes by, and we just sort of are immersed in it. We do our own thing, even though our setting is the same. We don't have anything that is variable. Everything is static. Yet we survive. And the title encapsulates every story in any, because each of these stories is a stained glass window away. And it tells you something different, and it shows you something different colors, different shades. It's a mosaic, as Sana rightly put in her editorial. That was the word, right?
Yeah.
That's
That is one of the words we were
That was
posting around when we were discussing the title of the book. Several words, but then we settled down with the stained glass. I'm glad we did. It's a little artistic as well.
No, I think it encapsulates the book really well. So I did have one last final question before we begin to take questions from the audience. What do you hope the readers take from this book on a whole?
I hope they don't take a lot as a whole, but they take it in bits. Yeah. I hope, since there's so much diversity in this book, there's so many voices in this book, there's a take on humor, poking fun at ourselves, our own superstitious selves. There's, there are these stories of gloom and doom and darkness. There is a story which tells that an ambulance cannot reach to someone who needs it at time because of the lockdowns and stuff, closed gates. There's a story that speaks of isolation, of solitude, and being all right with it. The first one, I think that's the first story. There is a story that brings together several experiences. I think that's the second story. It brings together several experiences, of the pandemic. That there's isolation. There is still, you go and meet your friends. You go to a restaurant, but closed, and you have memories. You have retrospect. So I think the point was never to give them one bit to the readers. I think the point was just to allow the readers, or just make the readers realize that there are different realities out there, different bits of reality, and they can connect to anyone. And since one can connect to one kind of reality or two kinds of realities, does not really take away from the other kinds of realities that are out there, just because they are not being experienced by us. So the purpose of the book was never to, bring together one collect thing, or one result or one conclusion. It was always to, the purpose of any anthology or any collection of stories is always to give different bits and put them together. I think I'm not really sure where I read this or heard this, but there is this quotation that always sometimes does the rounds on the internet, that bits put together, they have a larger influence than the whole itself. Because when different bits come together, then that means the composition has so much character, so much personality. There are different things to take away from it. I think that's how I see it.
I love that perspective. I think the convergence of
Yeah.
stories and reflections coming together.
Yeah,
It's great.
thank you. Uh-huh.
Taha, what about you? Oh, I think he might be frozen.
Yeah, he might, I think, looks like.
Okay, we can wait a minute for Taha. Meanwhile, I think we can start taking questions also
Yeah,
from the.
please go ahead.
If you have a question, just drop it down and we'll start answering them. I'd like to ask a question. How can we differentiate fiction to non-fiction in terms of literature? How can fiction be understood without really
Reality.
So
reality?
Oh,
Oh,
that's bad.
you want to take this question while Taha fixes his internet?
Yeah, I think you should.
Yeah, without reality. I think that just comes from greater instinct sometimes. It's when you sit down to pen a narrative down and you make an active effort to pencil. There's this thing. It's called verisimilitude. That it's when you write in a form that's like reality, but it's not reality or realism. And I think that's what a lot of writing captures. At least for me, I follow that stream of consciousness form of writing, and
Yeah.
I think it's clear that there's a distinct difference between my reality and fiction. Yeah.
Yes.
Sana,
I
what
saw
about?
that in your story as well.
oh,
I saw that in your
sorry
story.
about that.
No,
Oh,
no, I'm glad you're back. So we can have the
I'm
question back, could we?
yeah, we can have a question back. Taha, I can just kind of convey to you as well. It was about the distinction between reality and fiction. You can
all
see it.
right.
Yeah, it's really quite small.
Okay, it is. Yeah. Yeah. So, who would like to begin?
Oh,
Yeah, we're waiting for you to answer the question.
Okay, I would like to ask. Okay, how do we differentiate between fiction and non-fiction in terms of literature? How can fiction be understood without reality, and vice versa? That's an interesting question. I think there is a very clear-cut distinction between fiction and non-fiction, but for me, fiction is dealing with a medley of voices. Non-fiction is dealing with hard facts and cold realities. And I think I personally enjoy working with fiction more because it allows me the opportunity to venture into the unknown. Whereas nonfiction, when I do write it, is something that I know everything about before I'm writing it. So the exploration is almost predefined.
yeah,
But yeah,
it's a good question to ask journalists and
ex-
novelists.
exactly, exactly.
Definitely. Sana, what about your take on the question?
Mahin, fiction and non-fiction are worlds apart.
Yeah,
Yeah,
It's I don't know what to say here. Fiction has its own thing. Fiction is like, when writers have put their imagination, their experiences, and their observations into storytelling format. Yeah. And nonfiction is when you are just talking about how things are there, out there. So, they all have different genres, both of them. I think the other part of the question was something that would have rather evoked
so
interest.
without reality, looking at
Yeah, it was
fiction.
about how reality and fiction, they have a connection. I think they sometimes they do and sometimes they do not. I mean, not all genres deal with realism, and that's fine. That gives a,
Yeah. I mean, there's a
a
specific
diverse
genre
flavor.
that deals with the mixed
Yeah,
race.
exactly. So realism and but if in terms of this book, this question is being asked, since we have been very realistic about this,
Mhm.
um, all the stories are set in realism, then I think that is that just depends on the kind of book one is reading or writing. I mean,
Mhm.
if genre demands realism, then realism is going to be there. If the genre
Yeah,
doesn't demand, then there's no need. Dystopia doesn't need realism. Speculative fiction doesn't need it. So I mean, sometimes imagination, sometimes realism. I
mhm,
think that depends on the genre.
exactly.
But since we were telling stories of the pandemic, so they had to be set in realism.
We did have another question. I think it's
Sorry.
gone now,
Yeah.
but it
Yeah.
was,
I saw Zofine's comment. Thank you for being here, Zofine.
Thank you so much.
do you think fiction around the pandemic will become the norm, or is this trend timely?
Well, I think our lives are going to be colored by this pandemic for many, many decades because it's radically altered the nature of our lives right now. And I think there will be a long-term impact. So maybe this is our World War II moment
Yeah, I was
where
going to say
maybe,
the same thing.
yeah,
I was just about to give a reference to the war literature, but
exactly.
I don't. To be honest, I don't think there's some people who categorically state that we want to stay away from all the sickness and all the pandemic and lockdown stuff. There are writers, there are readers. So I think it could go both ways. I mean, there has been literature on sickness and pandemics and the Spanish flu and the black fever and the plagues and all that. There has been, but not all of those have been read. I mean, even those who enjoy classics, maybe if they want to stay away from these or steer away from these things, then maybe they will. So it can go both ways. I think that this
Exactly.
has already taxed us so much, that to see this kind of book or this kind of genre 10 years is, I see it's a little it's a little difficult to see that some
Yeah,
novelist writing about the pandemic 10 or 20 years. It's going to be, I don't,
maybe. Yeah.
it's just a matter of choice, I guess.
It
It
might
could,
just be in the backdrop, if anything. I think that's what I
Yes, it
feel.
could be. Yes, that could be it. A psychological
That
thing
could be it.
about
Psychological.
being imprisoned or things. Yeah, that could definitely be
I think
so.
it definitely will continue, though. People will continue to have a lot of shared trauma relating to the pandemic. And of course, writing is a way to live through trauma. And just generally, after moments of darkness or isolation, a lot of literature, fascinating, interesting, shaking literature, stems from it. I think after any, like, before the Age of Enlightenment, Renaissance, Romanticism, we had all of
Yeah.
these periods. So I think the literature will continue to speak for itself. It depends on the writers and readers what they choose to write,
Yes.
what they choose to read.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. We can take another question now as well. But I'm interested to see though, definitely. Can you add the list of contributing authors to this description of this video?
Or we could name them.
Right.
Just
Yeah, you guys can name them, I think.
go ahead, Taha, you have the book.
Definitely. I have the book. I'm going to name them. Um, I guess I'll go in ascending order. Why not?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have Naveed Shahzad. We have Amir Hussain, Romana Hussain, Ifat Said, Nighat Dad, Atia Daud, myself and Sana, Menaz Mir, who has a book out recently, Farazia, Huma Sheikh, Vajiha Heather, Ilona Yusuf, Kulsum Bano, Natasha Japanwala, Zofin Ibrahim, Nida Usman Chaudhry, Shabano Alvi, Safina Danishilahi, Nirvan Nadeem, Aisha Ummatul Rashid, Tamreez Inam, Maheen Humayun, who's right here in front of us, uh, Awais Khan, and Mohammad Shiraz Dasti. So,
And Mehwash Amin as well.
and Mehvish, I think I started from like
The fiction part. Yeah.
one below the intro. Yeah, Nevish, we've discussed her poem as well.
Yeah.
So that's 27, 26 authors in total, and 26 experiences that you might want to dive into. the beauty of a short story is that as I was saying this before I got disconnected, was that they take you into separate, almost self-contained worlds. So I think that's what a book like this could be. The takeaway for any reader would be that these are stories that you can immerse yourself in. And as Sana said, um, just because you could relate to one and can't relate to the other, that doesn't negate the one you don't relate to in any way. It's an experience. It's something that people went through. So yeah,
Definitely. I agree. Okay. If we don't have any more questions, anything you guys would like to say, aside from, of course, everyone, you should order your copies or go get them.
definitely. It's now on sale, and I'm going to try and hold this up as well. This is it. The stained glass window. It's here, Sana. Finally, it's
Congratulations
Yeah,
to the two of you,
yeah,
and I'm sure
me
everyone
too.
is looking forward to it. And thank you all for coming to the session. We're so excited for you to read all the
thank you
stories.
so much.
Thank you very
It's
much.
incredible. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.